Well, hi there. Welcome to episode 353 of Roqe. I'm Jian. This is a special edition on the occasion of the death of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Mr. Carter, who was America's president from 1976 to 1980, is being mourned, as you know, around the globe today by world leaders, American citizens, history buffs, human rights aficionados. He is for many an embodiment of virtue and integrity from a previous era. But if you're a non-Iranian, don't be surprised if your Iranian friends are, for better or for worse, less kind in their remembrances today. Rather, Jimmy Carter is seen by many Iranians as the person who tragically let Iran slip away and enabled a dangerous theocracy to enter the fray. The truth, as ever, may not be quite as reductive, but don't be surprised if some of your Iranian friends are less forgiving in remembering Jimmy Carter. First and foremost, let's acknowledge that Mr. Carter truly owned many of the impressive attributes that he's being lauded for upon his passing. He was undeniably smart, a shrewd political actor, a leader who accomplished some gargantuan feats like the Camp David peace accords. And more, upon completing his one-term presidency, Carter dedicated himself to 4 decades of helping the poor, building houses, living by the commitment to his faith. But when it comes to Iran, there is simply no way to spin his legacy to save face. There's no way to see the role he played with grace. Don't be surprised if your Iranian friends are less forgiving in remembering Jimmy Carter. Carter's legacy regarding Iran is a contentious chapter in the history of U.S. foreign policy, marked by actions and inactions that arguably paved the way for the murderous Islamic Republic's rise to power. Carter initially embraced Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, as a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the region, praising Iran under his rule as a stabilizing force. However, his administration's wavering support during the Shah's final years reflected a critical misreading of Iran's political and social currents. When protests erupted against the monarchy in '78, Carter hesitated between endorsing reform and maintaining loyalty to the Shah, creating an environment of uncertainty that emboldened revolutionaries. Don't be surprised if your Iranian friends are less forgiving in remembering Jimmy Carter. Nor is it accurate or reasonable to place all the blame for the coming of Khomeini and the fall of the Shah on the shoulders of Carter, as if this was entirely his intention. In fact, as my guest today, Carter biographer Kai Bird suggests, Carter's Iran policy was almost more a product of omission rather than commission. While he maintained a focus on Israel and Egypt as a peace pact, Carter neglected the reality and risk on the ground in Iran. Carter's ultimate decision to distance the U.S. from the Shah while allowing Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamist faction to assume leadership revealed a profound failure to anticipate the consequences of empowering a theocratic regime. His administration's mismanagement during the Shah's exile, coupled with the tepid response to Iran's growing unrest, gave Khomeini the opportunity to consolidate power. The U.S. Embassy hostage crisis, which erupted shortly after the Islamic Republic's establishment, symbolized the fallout from Carter's inability to grasp the revolutionary movement's ideological fervor and anti-American sentiment. In retrospect, Carter's inconsistent policy not only abandoned a key U.S. ally, but also facilitated the rise of a regime that would perpetuate decades of regional instability, human rights abuses, and enmity toward the West, not to mention terrorizing the Iranian people themselves. Today, a special edition of Roqe focused on Jimmy Carter with a conversation with American historian and journalist Kai Bird, Redux, on his Carter biography entitled Outlier. Trying to continue to stay as nuanced as we can be. This is Roqe, episode 353. It's December 30th, 2024. This is Roqe. Welcome to episode 353 of Roqe. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Hello to you from Toronto. Salam Dustan Aziz. Durud bar shoma. Hope you're doing well wherever you are tuning in from around the world. Happy post-Christmas. Happy almost New Year. We will have our first episode of The Roqe in 2025. That's this Thursday, January 2nd, with an amazing lineup of guests joining us on the question, will change come to Iran in 2025? I think we've booked about 12 guests for this. It's going to be quite a conversation. Will change come to Iran in 2025? We'll try and use our crystal ball this Thursday, January 2nd, the first episode of Roqe in the new year. But first, today a special edition. So you have likely heard of the death of President Jimmy Carter yesterday at the age of 100. We want to replay a conversation for you from episode 196 of Roqe with Carter biographer, American historian, and journalist Kai Bird. This is from a couple of years ago. It's a chat that was inspired by Mr. Bird's book called Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, a book which explores the man and the paradoxes and contradictions he embodied, especially when it came to Iran policy. Let's get you to that conversation right now. Cheers. There is no event more impactful on the cleavage between Iranian and American relations in recent decades than the hostage crisis of 1979. This was the event that began on November 4th, 1979, when student activists or militants in Iran seized 66 American citizens at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 of them hostage for more than a year. The crisis took place during the chaotic aftermath of Iran's Islamic Revolution, and the precipitant for the crisis was a raging anger towards the United States on the part of the revolutionaries in Iran, and particularly anger at the administration of President Jimmy Carter for allowing the exiled and ill Shah of Iran, who was deeply unpopular at this point and had fled the country, to seek and receive asylum in America. This followed a confused and vacillating period where President Carter had, of course, supported and then not really supported and then not at all supported the Shah as revolution occurred in Iran. And the event marked a major political liability for Carter. Indeed, the hostage crisis would hang over his neck for the final 444 days of his presidency. So what was the role of Jimmy Carter vis-a-vis the Shah, the revolution, and the hostage crisis? And how might there have been any other outcome if Carter had managed his foreign affairs differently? Well, to reflect on these questions, I'm joined by a Pulitzer Prize-winning author who has recently published a book about Carter and this very subject. Kai Bird is an American historian, journalist, columnist, and acclaimed author who has gained global recognition for his biographies of political figures. Mr. Bird is an elected member of the prestigious Society of American Historians. He was born in Eugene, Oregon. As a child of a U.S. Foreign Service officer, he spent most of his childhood in Jerusalem, Beirut, Saudi Arabia, Cairo, and Bombay. He came back to the U.S. to continue his education and obtained a master's in journalism from Northwestern University. Mr. Bird's publications include The Chairman, John J. McCloy, and the Making of the American Establishment. His award-winning book, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, Coming of Age Between the Arabs and Israelis, and The Good Spy, The Life and Death of Robert Ames. Mr. Bird's latest book from 2021, last year, entitled The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, is the one we're focusing on today. And right now, Kai Bird joins me from Washington, D.C. today. Hello, sir.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you on the show, and it's a really, really interesting book you've written about Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, well, most people think of Jimmy Carter as this fuzzy humanitarian do-gooder who builds houses for Habitat for Humanity and, was a great ex-president, but they regard him as a failed president.
Yes.
And my narrative, I think, paints a quite different picture of a man who is actually extremely political and politically devious at times, and ambitious and smart and very complicated man.
It's interesting that you should begin there because I obviously I'm going to focus on the hostage crisis in our chat, but I was going to ask you this as a general question first because you're quite right. The general vibe on Jimmy Carter, if you will, and these days seems to be nice, decent ex-president, as you say, who was a failure as a president. And the failure part, of course, is animated by what seemed like a vacillating, capricious, messy policy when it came to Iran by the late 70s, and of course the hostage crisis. I was surprised in your book by your depiction of Carter as, I mean, he's unquestionably smart. We knew that part, but also headstrong, tenacious, even arrogant, determined to win at all costs. How do we reconcile these different impressions of him?
Well, it's hard to reconcile because the impression that we have of Jimmy Carter just doesn't fit the reality of the man. He was exactly what you have described him as, tenacious, and he's certainly decent, but I argue in the book he's probably the smartest, most intellectually capable president who's occupied the Oval Office in the 20th century, and hardworking and politically smart too. So it's hard to figure out why the myth, the public perception of Carter is just the opposite of the reality of the man.
He doesn't seem very politically smart, certainly in retrospect, and I guess at the time when it came to Iran. I mean, let me begin in that this infamous toast that Carter does to the Shah of Iran on New Year's Eve, leading into 1978. That's because it's often discussed as a painful example of how tone deaf Carter and his administration were to the unrest that was bubbling in Iran and would lead to a revolution a few months later. Why was Carter so bad at reading the room, so to speak, at a crucial moment when it came to Iran?
Well, the toast at that late date was inept, as it turns out in retrospect. But at the time, every American official and every CIA estimate at the time was saying that the Shah's regime was stable and was going to be there for years, if not decades to come. And Carter, came in pledging to put human rights at the center of U.S. foreign policy. And so he was actually inclined to be rather critical of the Shah's regime, but he was persuaded that, the Shah was there. He wasn't going anywhere. It was a stable regime. And so on that trip, he gave the toast. I don't think it was a matter of being tone deaf. It was just a matter of bad intelligence, and the conventional wisdom was so set and concrete at that point that he didn't resist it. But as you can see in the narrative, he certainly had doubts about the Shah as things progressed and as the revolution gathered steam. He played a quite different role.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the fascinating things you say in your book, because you talk about this, how as we get into 1978, you write that the CIA is saying Iran is, literally the quote from the CIA, Iran is not in a revolutionary situation. This is by the summer of 1978, demonstrating how the CIA doesn't always get it right.
Right.
But you say, interestingly, that Carter's instincts were different from that, and that he should have listened to his own instincts. What makes you say that, and what were his instincts?
Well, his instincts were to be critical of an authoritarian Pahlavi regime, and he genuinely believed in human rights and the values of human rights, and so he was skeptical of the Shah. But so he should have followed his own instincts. This is the man who appointed Pat Darien, a civil rights activist, to become Assistant Secretary of State for a newly created division of the State Department on human rights. And he defended Darien, who was a strong critic of the Iranian regime. And, people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, was sort of a typical Cold War hawk who thought of the Shah as an ally and an ally against the Russian communist bear. But Carter his instincts were to side always with Pat Darien, and his instincts were to be critical of Zbig Brzezinski and to be critical of the Shah. So as the revolution suddenly got started in September of 78 with street demonstrations, Carter took a 5-minute break from his negotiations with Anwar Sadat
the phone call
in Camp David to have a phone call with the Shah and remonstrate with him, saying, I hope you can respect human rights and also restore law and order, but respect human rights. And that was the end.
Well, the call happens on September 8th, 1978, right after the army has opened fire on a massive crowd of thousands in Tehran's Jaleh Square.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so Carter's at Camp David with Sadat and Begin, and he calls the Shah. I mean, what happens in this call?
Well, I just briefly described it in the book, and it's a very short conversation, but he sort of in a perfunctory way says, I hope you can restore law and order, and I hope you can respect human rights. Two contradictory instructions at that moment. But the Shah, characterized the demonstrators and the street demonstrators as communists and subversives, and indicated he was going to crack down on them. But Carter was very much distracted. He wasn't paying attention to Iran at this point. His intelligence from the CIA was that the regime was stable and was going to be there forever. And he was concentrated on trying to bring peace between Arabs and Israelis. So
you say that this call was somehow seen or promoted as as Carter continuing to stand by the Shah at this point, yes?
Well, I think that's, unfortunately how it was interpreted by the Iranian people, and, probably by the press. But it was a perfunctory phone call. It was, something he was told he had to do to respond to what was happening in Iran. But he wasn't paying attention, and he hadn't, realized, certainly in September of 1978, he didn't realize that a revolution was brewing. But he did make the point that the Shah should pay attention to human rights and try to respect the human rights of all Iranians. But this was, it was, as I said, it was a perfunctory phone call.
But it also really, as you point out, it underscores the paradox at work here, right? Which is, please respect human rights. Also, please crack down on the protesters. So, I mean, what's the advice there? And that seems to be a symbol of what happens in this period with the Carter administration. How significant is the rivalry at this point that's taking place in the Carter admin between, specifically when it comes to Iran policy, between, as you say, Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, and his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance?
Right. Well, it was very significant. And as the revolution grew more and more ominous as such, and the street demonstrations grew more, took to the streets and threatened the regime, Brzezinski and Cy Vance began to argue about how to respond to this. And Carter, again, his instincts were to side with Cy Vance, who argued that we can't intervene, we can't launch a coup d'etat, we can't control the situation, whereas Zbig Brzezinski was arguing, we have to show that we are standing by our longtime ally, the Shah. We have to consider a possible green light for a coup d'etat. Brzezinski was again playing the sort of Cold War hawk, and Cy Vance was saying, no, let's calm down now. The intelligence is mixed now. We don't know what's going to happen. We're not in control of the situation. We have to be prepared for perhaps the Shah falling. And by December within just a few months. People forget how quickly this happened.
Right.
By December, it was clear that the Shah was on his way out, and they brought in George Ball to do a quick review of all the intelligence. And this veteran diplomat bluntly said, we've got to cut our losses. The regime is falling apart, and there's no chance for its survival. So we have to prepare the way to try to deal with the successor regime, whoever they may be. And of course, then there was an argument about, well, maybe there'll be social democratic moderates who will come to power with the religious leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, as a spiritual figurehead. That was the hope that people like George Ball and Cy Vance were sort of peddling. And, Foreign Service officers in the State Department who spoke Farsi and had some expertise about the situation were hoping that perhaps that would play out as the scenario. But as we all know, things quickly went a different route down the road to a theocracy.
I was a little confused or puzzled by Brzezinski's actions in your book. I was trying to get my head around it because he's clearly the hawk in the room, but as you describe him, he's the one counseling Carter late into 78 that there's not going to be a revolution. And then he's advocating for harsh military action when things get dire. So he doesn't seem to have a good sense of what's happening on the ground either, right?
Oh, absolutely. I argue in the book against all the conventional wisdom here in Washington, D.C., that Zbig Brzezinski was way in over his head. He's a Polish American who his foreign policy expertise was entirely focused on the Cold War and the rivalry between America and the Soviet Union. And he had this Polish animus against the Soviets, against everything Russian. And he saw every conflict, every foreign policy issue in the world through this Cold War prism. So he looked at what the Shah's regime stood for, and he saw, this is a right-wing anti-communist regime, so we should support it. And he knew nothing about the internal politics of Iran. I think this is true not only of Iran, but of the Middle East in general and of Asia. Again, he had this sort of very narrow view of the world. And I think he led Carter down the wrong path many times. And Carter, what is peculiar in my narrative is that Carter sort of enjoys Zbig's company, enjoys arguing with him, but rejects 99% of his advice, but refuses to fire him, keeps him on, and slowly Zbig sort of poisons the well and poisons Carter's relationship with the State Department and with Cy Vance. And in the end, it's Cy Vance who ends up resigning, not Brzezinski.
But you're quite right. You're quite right that it seems like, in retrospect today, posthumously, Zbig Brzezinski is seen as some sort of foreign policy guru, that he was this sagacious foreign policy leader, which is certainly not what we get in your book.
Yeah, no, it's not at all what you get in my book. I'm very critical of Zbig Brzezinski. I think he was wrong repeatedly on many, many difficult issues.
You say something interesting. I think you said it in an interview where you said you appreciate that Carter understood what he didn't understand about Iran. Why does he deserve credit for that?
Oh, because, too many foreign policy experts claim to know too much about the rest of the world when, in fact, they know nothing. And they're ignorant often of the internal politics of a complicated society like Iran. And Carter was just the opposite. He was a man who, came out of Georgia politics, had no foreign policy background, and he was perfectly willing to admit to the fact that he didn't know a lot about the rest of the world, and he was kind of skeptical of this foreign policy establishment that claimed to know everything.
He was really invested in the Middle East peace process, so the accords with Begin and Sadat. Why wasn't he more invested in Iran?
Well, that's also sort of a complicated issue about goes back to his own personality and history. Remember, he's a Southern Baptist, born-again Christian. He has no foreign policy experience, but he has, read the Bible repeatedly. And he has this notion about when he achieves power, when he wins this very improbable election in 1976 and comes from nowhere to win the White House, he has this notion that once he has won power, he should do good with it. And he looks at the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and he thinks, well, maybe I can bring peace to this troubled region, the region he calls the Holy Land. He refers to it as the Holy Land. So he becomes obsessed with the issue, and against the advice of Brzezinski and even Cy Vance and the entire foreign policy establishment says, Mr. President, you don't want to take on Arab-Israeli peace. It's a black hole. It's a tar baby. It's a hopeless issue. Carter thinks that no, he can, with the force of his personality and his personal diplomacy and his personal relationship with Anwar Sadat in particular. He can make progress, and indeed he does at Camp David.
I want to get to the hostage crisis and the meat of what we're talking about today. Let me ask you for a little context to begin with. I was a little kid at the time who had just come from Canada, but I can remember, and I certainly remember this because I was Iranian, that the hostage crisis leading the news on American TV networks seemingly for months, every single night. I mean, this is the pre-OJ and the White Bronco 24/7 cable news era. Just how big was the hostage crisis in Iran when it came to the attention of American media, citizens, and in fact the entire world?
Oh, it was an enormous story. And, Nightline made its name with Ted Koppel starting that news program, and that was on very late every night. And it would start with, well, this is day 23 of the hostage crisis, or day 340 of the hostage crisis. And it was, agonizing. And they would report in great detail about the back-channel negotiations of attempting to get the release of the hostages. And, it was an enormous story, and it was deeply politically damaging to the Carter presidency. And ironically, he actually was not responsible and tried to do everything to prevent the hostages from being taken. And he actually predicted, in his diary, he made a prediction months before the hostages were taken, that if he gave political asylum to the Shah, he was afraid that American hostages would be taken at our embassy in Tehran, and then what would he do?
That's a perfect segue. Thank you, because that's where I wanted to go with this. The immediate precipitant for the student action of seizing the U.S. embassy in Tehran was the exiled Shah being allowed refuge in America. Why, after strongly resisting the idea, did Carter relent and allow the Shah, who was in exile and dying of cancer, to enter the U.S. for medical treatment? Why did he give in to Kissinger and Rockefeller?
Yeah, that again, it's a tragedy, and I think no longer a mystery. We know what happened, but the Shah goes into exile, and initially to Egypt, and then Morocco, and for months, Carter is badgered by Henry Kissinger, a retired national security advisor, and David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and John McCloy, a powerful Wall Street lawyer. And they actually set up a private lobbying operation dubbed Project Alpha, and they appropriate money for this to hire a publicist, and they assign a lawyer from McCloy's law firm to work full-time on this, and they set out a schedule of where every week someone in the Carter administration is called up or taken out to lunch and lobbied to stand by the Shah, our old friend, and give him political asylum. And Carter says no repeatedly for months and months. And
because he thinks this is going to ignite.
He looks at the Shah as a deposed dictator. Why should we do anything for him at this point? And yes, there will be some political consequences perhaps in Iran, and this will make our relations with the new regime even more difficult. And what's the upside to it? And the upside, he's told by Henry Kissinger and McCloy and Rockefeller, is, well, we have to show that we're standing by our allies, our old friends. This is, it was political theater, but in fact what was going on was that behind the scenes, Chase Manhattan Bank, I believe, was trying to get access to money. They had at risk $500 million in loans that the Shah had taken out. And remember, they persuaded Carter to freeze Iranian assets. Right. And so they were trying to get, it was all about money.
But that explains McCloy. Is that also Rockefeller and Kissinger's
very much it was Rockefeller. And Kissinger went along with it. And, Kissinger also, I'm sure, truly believed in the argument that we have to show the rest of the world that we stand by our former, our long-standing friends, regardless of whether they're in or out of power. It was ridiculous. And Carter understood that it was bad diplomacy and might have terrible consequences. But finally, in late October of 1979, when he learns that Cy Vance has changed his mind because of the information that the Shah is sick with cancer and is ailing and needs medical treatment in New York City. So again, on humanitarian grounds, Carter finally gives in and agrees to allow the Shah to come to New York. And of course, 4 days later, this precipitates the hostage crisis.
How misguided do you believe this decision would prove to be, and how do you believe the course of history would have been different if Carter had not let the Shah in?
Yeah, I think if Carter had appointed George Ball as his national security advisor instead of big Brzezinski, this never would have happened. And history would have taken a different course, and the Shah would have gone into exile, and there would have been no hostage crisis. I don't think Carter could have done anything to stop the revolution. Khomeini was riding to power, and Khomeini, as we, looking back on it, he was determined to create a theocracy. And I think all of that would have happened. But Khomeini, when the Shah was given asylum, the students took over the embassy, and he seized the political opportunity to create a crisis that would allow him to engage, to orchestrate a purge internally of the new revolutionary regime and get rid of so-called moderates like Ibrahim Yazdi and Gobsadeh eventually and others. And this allowed him to cement his power and to create a really cruel theocratic dictatorship. So it was extremely unfortunate that Carter was persuaded by Brzezinski and McCloy and Rockefeller to allow the Shah to come to New York. And as it turns out, we now know that medically speaking, the Shah would have gotten better treatment outside of America. In fact, the doctors in New York mistreated his medical maladies and made things worse. But that's another story.
This hostage crisis becomes an albatross that hangs around Carter's neck, as I said in the introduction, for his final 440 days of his presidency. His instincts in the beginning are to try to find a peaceful solution. Nothing works. How do we explain the vacillation in this period? Is this again the divisions within his administration? Why does it seem like there was no clear policy for something so profoundly important on the world stage?
Well, again, I would take issue with the word vacillation. I don't think he vacillated. In fact, he decided from the very beginning that he was not going to use force, as Presidency, for instance, was urging him to do. Because he feared that using force in this situation would endanger the lives of the hostages. So he sided with Cy Vance again and argued that diplomacy and time would take care of this. And he did so knowing that this was going to be very politically costly. And so he stuck by his convictions on this for months and months, up until late March, when he finally, after months of frustrating back-channel negotiations and private emissaries going to Paris and trying to get someone inside the Iranian regime to talk to them and failing, getting close again and again and yet failing. Finally, in late March, Brzezinski persuaded him to explore the military option of a helicopter rescue mission.
Right, Desert One.
Desert One. And, in my narrative, I think I make a very convincing argument that this helicopter rescue mission was doomed from the beginning. It was just way too complicated, too many moving parts. If the helicopters had not had mechanical failures, and some of them had been forced to turn back, and if they'd actually made it into Tehran with the rescue operation, dozens of people would have been killed, Iranian and probably many of the American hostages. It was a disaster, and it was a disaster in what happened in the end. It
Pretty bad look for Carter at that point.
And it was a political blow to Carter.
Yeah. There's long-standing speculation, as you know, and you write about that, there was a deal in place between the Khomeini regime and the CIA to delay the release of the hostages until after the election, and that then Reagan, if he assumed the presidency, which he did, would treat the Iranians favorably, ensuring their access to military goods and frozen assets. And this would actually form the seeds of the Iran-Contra scandal. How much validity is there to that?
Well, you're referring to the October surprise, the so-called October surprise, and I devote a whole chapter by that name to this issue. And it was, it's very controversial. Historians argue about what exactly happened, but I found documents, and I think a critical document that shows that indeed, in the summer of 1980, as the hostage crisis was going on and on, Ronald Reagan, who was becoming the Republican nominee for president, his campaign manager was Bill Casey. And Bill Casey disappeared for a long weekend, first to London in late July of 1980, and then made, I argue, a secret trip to Madrid, Spain, where he met with a representative of the Ayatollah Khomeini. This meeting occurred, I believe, and Casey apparently told the Khomeini emissary, you guys will get a better deal from my candidate, Ronald Reagan, who understands Iran and is a friend of Iran, and unlike Jimmy Carter. And I think this, was almost an act of treason on Casey's part. I don't think Reagan necessarily had to know about it, but Casey loved sort of skullduggery of this kind and covert operations, and indeed he later was appointed by Reagan as his CIA director. But this is exactly the kind of sort of off-the-book covert operation that Casey loved to engage in, and I think he did it, and it contributed to prolonging the hostage crisis because there were negotiations going on, and in September they were very close to a deal. working out, a financial arrangement and a release of all of the hostages. And at the last minute, it was delayed once again,
Right.
And that led to time running out for Carter in terms of the election.
And the conspicuous timing of the release of the hostages when Reagan comes to power. Would you go so far as to say that the Khomeini regime saw the incoming Reagan administration as these are guys we can do business with?
Yes. I think Khomeini understood that Reagan his people had made this overture. And Khomeini had it in his head that Carter was an enemy of the Iranian people because of his famous toast to the Shah in December of '77, and because of his perception that Carter had opposed the Iranian Revolution, which I think is an exaggeration. And as we've talked about, I think Carter was very ambivalent and critical of the Shah's regime. And yet Khomeini had this perception that Carter was an enemy, and he did everything he could to sort of see him defeated.
It's a fascinating period, and it's a fascinating book, and I really appreciate the time you've given us. Let me ask you a couple of final questions about Carter and the way he's seen through the lens of history 4 decades removed now. I mean, the Carter administration's term is often portrayed as a period of international impotence, especially due to the Iranian hostage crisis. Is that fair to Jimmy Carter?
No, it's not fair. It's true that he became impotent as such through his refusal to use military force. If he had, right after the hostages were taken, if he had mined the Iranian harbors or launched air raids and killed a bunch of people and maybe saw some of the hostages killed, he would have been more popular. That would have been a politically advantageous thing for him to do. But Carter really had principles, and he was willing to sacrifice his own political capital to do the right thing. And he did this not only, with regard to Iran, he did this in his dealings with Israel, which is why he is so unpopular in Israel even to this day. He did this repeatedly on domestic issues. He was the kind of rare politician who decided that once he had achieved political power, he was going to do the righteous thing. And his wife, constantly was nagging him, Jimmy, please, why don't you postpone some of these more difficult issues like the Panama Canal Treaty or Middle East peace to your second term? Don't you want to get reelected? And Carter, insisted that he needed to do the right thing when he had power. And it made him a righteous president and sometimes an extremely effective and powerful president. But it also led to his political vulnerabilities. And ultimately, he, lost his chance for re-election because of the Iranian Revolution, because he had ticked off liberals in his own party and stimulated a challenge by Ted Kennedy for the Democratic nomination. He alienated some of his own political allies in an effort to do the right thing.
Well, in terms of what he actually did do, and sort of ending off where we started with that idea that persists now of Carter as the nice guy, decent ex-president who was a shitty president. You write on Jimmy Carter, this is your words, no modern president worked harder at the job and few achieved more than Carter. That's certainly not the way he gets treated by the media or opinionators in reflecting on great American presidents these days, but from the past, where Carter tends to always rate quite low. What are they missing?
Well, they're missing his achievements. They forget that this is the president who deregulated the American airline industry, allowing middle-class Americans to fly for the first time in large numbers. He deregulated the trucking and railroad industries. He deregulated natural gas, which eventually led to America's boom in natural gas and fracking and energy independence. He even made it possible for Americans to drink decent beer with the deregulation of the alcohol industry, which allowed boutique breweries to pop up in cities all over America. He mandated that seatbelts and airbags had to be built into every new American car manufactured, and this alone saved 10,000 lives every year. Abroad, he passed the Panama Canal Treaty. He negotiated a SALT II treaty. He negotiated the Camp David peace accords that took Egypt off the battlefield for Israel for 2 generations. And yet Carter, despite all these achievements, because he was defeated, because he was a one-term president, because he was followed by Ronald Reagan and this sort of conservative revolution that changed America, he's regarded as politically ineffectual and weak. But it's a ahistorical tale, and my book, I hope, does much to sort of set the record straight.
Kai Bird, it's been a great conversation and a great education. I thank you for this today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Kai Bird, an American historian, journalist, and columnist, and the acclaimed author of his latest book, and this is from 2021, entitled The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. Kai Bird joined me from Washington, D.C. today. There you go. Thanks so much for joining us for this special edition of Roqe. Thanks to Kai Bird. That interview was from August of 2022 about President Carter and his legacy. He is now the late President Jimmy Carter. We'll hear a lot more about him in the coming days, I'm sure. It's been a good chance to talk about some Iran policy, though, when it comes to Carter. And give us your feedback, either by posting on our platforms where you're watching this or listening to this, or by sending us a note at info@roqemedia.com, info@roqemedia.com. Thanks to the amazing team who put this show together each week: Super Parisa, Seppi Wonder, Smart Pega, Savvy Roham, Tina, the photo and video queen. Special thanks to Bearded Omid, Talented Anahita, Methodical Kaveh, Solid Sammy, and thanks to Puyon, who helped us with some camera work today. We appreciate that. And thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Do subscribe if you haven't done so already. Remember, Roqe Live 4 is happening on February 6th, 2025. Tickets are available now. If you go to our Instagram page at Roqe Media and just press on the bio, it'll take you to the ticket link, or you can go to our website, roqemedia.com, find the link there as well. We are on Instagram at Roqe Media. You can find me on Instagram at Jian Gomeshi. As ever, thank you again for watching and supporting. And as ever, Mizon Bashi.